at a natural pace of 150 to 160 words per minute. Maintain clarity and light emotional nuance suitable for American storytelling. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawn of Oakridge Preparatory School, a jewel in the wealthy suburbs of Fairfax, Virginia, where manicured hedges and gleaming SUVs signaled privilege. Daniel Brooks, a 47-year-old custodian, moved through the courtyard with a broom, his navy uniform faded but neat, his dark eyes scanning the playground where kids chased each other, their laughter mingling with the distant hum of Friday night football practice. Daniel, a quiet fixture at Oakridge, had a knack for noticing the kids left behind, like Nathan Caldwell, a skinny 10-year-old who lingered alone on the swings, his backpack sagging beside him. Nathan Caldwell, a real estate mogul whose developments dotted Northern Virginia, roared into the parking lot in a polished Range Rover, his phone pressed to his ear barking orders about a new condo project. He was a man who owned rooms before he entered them. His tailored blazer and steely gaze commanded respect. But when he stepped out and saw Daniel kneeling beside Liam, wiping dirt from the boy's scraped elbow with a gentleness that calmed Liam's trembling lip, Nathan's face twisted into a scowl. "What in God's name are you doing?" Nathan's voice cut through the courtyard like a whip, heads turning from the pickup line. "Get your hands off my son right now!" The words dripped with venom, each syllable a judgment on Daniel's black skin, his worn uniform, his place in their world. Parents froze, some pulling out phones, others whispering behind manicured hands. Liam flinched, clutching Daniel's sleeve tighter. "Dad, I fell, and Mr. Daniel was just—" "Shut it, Liam." Nathan stormed forward, his polished shoes clicking on the pavement. "You don't touch my kid, you hear me? Who do you think you are?" The accusation hung heavy, the word janitor unspoken but screaming in Nathan's glare. Daniel stood slowly, his broad shoulders squared, his hands steady despite the sting of being reduced to a stereotype. He'd felt this before, too many times, but it never got easier. "Mr. Caldwell," Daniel said, his voice low and even, like a man measuring his words as carefully as a carpenter measures wood. "Liam took a spill on the swings. I was cleaning up nearby and patched him up, nothing more." His calm was unnerving, a quiet defiance that made Nathan's jaw tighten. There was something in Daniel's eyes, a flicker of steel, a hint of a man who'd seen more than this courtyard, more than Nathan could guess, that set the billionaire on edge. Principal Margaret Voss, her pearls glinting in the fading light, hurried over, her voice strained with forced calm. "Mr. Caldwell, let's take this inside and sort it out." "Sort it out?" Nathan laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the school's brick facade. "This guy's got no business near my son. He's a custodian, not a damn nurse. I want him gone, Margaret, tonight." The crowd murmured, some nodding, their privilege blinding them to the injustice unfolding. A mother in yoga gear whispered, "You never know with these people," her words a knife in Daniel's gut. Liam's eyes darted to Daniel, wide with confusion and a flicker of fear, as Nathan yanked him away, the boy's sneakers dragging on the grass. Daniel's hands tightened on the broom handle, not from fear, but from a deep, controlled anger, the kind that had been forged in harder times. 15 years ago, he'd been Daniel Brooks, environmental engineer, a rising star at Ecotech Solutions, until a rigged whistleblower scandal tied to one of Nathan's early projects had stripped him of his career, his savings, his name. Now, sweeping floors at Oakridge, he was invisible to men like Nathan, but not for long. "I hear you, Mr. Caldwell," Daniel said, his voice carrying a weight that made a few parents pause. "But I've seen more than you think I have, and I'm not going anywhere just yet." Principal Margaret Voss, her pearls glinting in the fading light, hurried over, her voice strained with forced calm. "Mr. Caldwell, let's take this inside and sort it out." "Sort it out?" Nathan laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the school's brick facade. "This guy's got no business near my son. He's a custodian, not a damn nurse. I want him gone, Margaret, tonight." The crowd murmured, some nodding, their privilege blinding them to the injustice unfolding. A mother in yoga gear whispered, "You never know with these people." Her words a knife in Daniel's gut. Liam's eyes darted to Daniel, wide with confusion and a flicker of fear, as Nathan yanked him away, the boy's sneakers dragging on the grass. Daniel's hands tightened on the broom handle, not from fear, but from a deep, controlled anger, the kind that had been forged in harder times. 15 years ago, he'd been Daniel Brooks, environmental engineer, a rising star at Ecotech Solutions, until a rigged whistleblower scandal tied to one of Nathan's early projects had stripped him of his career, his savings, his name. Now, sweeping floors at Oakridge, he was invisible to men like Nathan. But not for long. "I hear you, Mr. Caldwell," Daniel said, his voice carrying a weight that made a few parents pause. "But I've seen more than you think I have, and I'm not going anywhere just yet."
At a natural pace of 150 to 160 words per minute, maintaining clarity and light emotional nuance suitable for American storytelling. As Nathan stormed off, Liam in tow, a groundskeeper named Eddie, a wiry older man with a Virginia drawl, sidled up to Daniel, his eyes sharp with understanding. "Don't let that hotshot get to you, Dan. I saw what you did for the kid. You're good people." Eddie's words, simple but fierce, were a lifeline in the sea of judgmental stares. Daniel gave a small nod, his lips twitching in a faint smile. In his pocket, a worn slide rule, a relic from his engineering days, pressed against his thigh, a reminder of who he'd been and what he could still do. Nathan, already on his phone in the parking lot, was dialing the school board, his voice loud enough for Daniel to catch fragments. Unacceptable, dangerous, fire him by morning. But as Daniel swept the last of the courtyard's leaves, his mind was already turning, sharp as the slide rule in his pocket. He'd overheard Nathan's calls before, late in this same parking lot, boasting about cutting corners on a development's waste disposal. Those words, careless and damning, were the first spark of a fire Nathan didn't know was coming. Daniel wasn't just sweeping floors tonight, he was laying the groundwork for a reckoning. The courtyard emptied, the whispers fading into the Virginia dusk, but the weight of Nathan's words lingered, a challenge Daniel had faced too many times. He wasn't just a custodian to Liam, who'd looked at him with trust, and he sure as hell wasn't the nobody Nathan thought he was. As he pushed his broom toward the storage shed, a single thought burned bright. This isn't over, not by a long shot. The morning after Nathan Caldwell's outburst, Oakridge Preparatory School buzzed with a different kind of energy, like a beehive poked with a stick. Parents whispered in the drop-off line, their eyes darting toward Daniel Brooks as he hauled a mop bucket across the cafeteria, his Navy uniform a silent rebuke to their gossip. "I heard he got too close to that Caldwell kid," one mother muttered, clutching her coffee cup like a shield. Colleagues who'd once swapped small talk with Daniel now gave him wide berths, their glances heavy with suspicion or pity. Supervisor Linda Carter caught him in the janitor's closet, her clipboard clutched tight, her voice clipped. "Daniel, we've had complaints. Parents are uneasy about you being around the kids. Stick to maintenance for now, okay?" Daniel nodded, his face a mask of calm, but inside, the words stung like salt in a cut. He'd been here before, 15 years ago, when a rigged scandal at Ecotech Solutions had branded him a whistleblower who couldn't be trusted. Now, at 47, he was just a custodian in their eyes, a black man who didn't belong near their precious kids. But Daniel wasn't one to buckle. He'd learned long ago that you don't fight prejudice with shouts, you fight it with smarts. As he polished hallway floors, Daniel's hands moved with the precision of a man who'd once drafted blueprints for clean energy systems. He kept his head down, but his mind was anything but idle. Every evening, when the school emptied and the Virginia sky turned bruise purple, he lingered in the parking lot, sweeping near Nathan's Range Rover during the Billionaire's late pickups. Nathan, oblivious, took calls on speakerphone, his voice carrying over the hum of crickets. The waste site's covered, nobody's digging there, EPA won't find a thing. Daniel's heart quickened, but his face stayed still as stone. In his pocket, the worn slide rule from his engineering days felt like a talisman, grounding him as he jotted notes in a small spiral notebook. Dates, times, phrases about cutting corners, and offshore permits. Each word was a brick in the wall he was building, one that would topple Nathan's empire.
At a natural pace of 150 to 160 words per minute. Maintain clarity and light emotional nuance suitable for American storytelling. Liam Caldwell, meanwhile, became Daniel's shadow. The boy, small for 10, with eyes that carried too much worry, started slipping away during recess to find Daniel in the boiler room or the supply closet. "Mr. Daniel, why's my dad so mad at you?" Liam asked one day, kicking at a scuff mark on the floor, his backpack slung low. Daniel knelt, meeting the boy's gaze, seeing the loneliness that mirrored his own as a kid growing up in a rough Richmond neighborhood. "Your dad's just looking out for you, Liam," Daniel said, his voice soft but firm. "But sometimes folks see what they want to see, not what's real." Liam nodded, chewing his lip, then pulled a crumpled drawing from his pocket, a sketch of a solar panel, jagged but earnest. "I made this in science class. You think it's any good?" Daniel's chest tightened. He recognized the hunger for approval, the kind he'd once sought from his own father, a mechanic who'd taught him to fix anything with patience and a steady hand. "It's better than good, kid," Daniel said, ruffling Liam's hair. "You keep at it, you'll build something big one day." Liam's shy smile was a small victory, a crack in the wall of Nathan's neglect. Nathan, on the other hand, was doubling down. At a PTA meeting, he leaned into his influence, his voice booming over catered sandwiches and iced tea. "I'm telling you, that custodian's trouble. I caught him with his hands on my son, and who knows what else he's up to. I want him out." Parents nodded, some out of fear, others out of habit, their wealth blinding them to Nathan's venom. He'd already called the school board, demanding Daniel's termination, and spread word at the local country club, painting Daniel as a shady character who'd crossed a line. Over beers at a Friday night happy hour, he bragged to his golf buddies, "I put that guy in his place. These types need to know where they belong." The words, casual and cruel, drifted back to Daniel through Eddie, the groundskeeper, who overheard them while mowing the club's lawn. Eddie, with his weathered face and Virginia drawl, pulled Daniel aside later, his eyes blazing. "Caldwell's talking smack, Dan. Don't let him win. You're worth 10 of him." Daniel gave a tight smile, his gratitude unspoken but deep. Eddie's loyalty, rough-edged and real, was a reminder that not everyone bought into Nathan's world. Daniel's real work happened after hours. He'd started digging into Nathan's company, Caldwell Developments, using skills honed at Ecotech, where he'd once traced environmental violations for clean energy projects. Late at night, in his one-bedroom apartment, he pored over public records on a second-hand laptop, cross-referencing Nathan's projects with EPA reports. A pattern emerged: illegal waste dumping at a Fairfax construction site, buried under forged permits. Daniel's pulse raced as he snapped photos of documents left in Nathan's unlocked car during the school event. Sloppy, arrogant mistakes. He reached out to Rachel Evans, a former Ecotech colleague turned environmental activist, meeting her at a dive bar far from Fairfax's prying eyes. Rachel, her hair streaked with gray but her fire undimmed, slid a USB drive across the table. "I've got contacts at the EPA," she said, her voice low. "Your photos are gold, but you need more to nail him. Keep digging." Daniel nodded, his jaw set. "I'm not stopping till it's done." At a natural pace of 150 to 160 words per minute. Maintain clarity and light emotional nuance suitable for American storytelling. Every slight, every whispered troublemaker from a parent, every averted glance from a colleague fueled Daniel's resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. Liam's drawings, his quiet trust, made that clear. The boy's world was crumbling under Nathan's neglect, and Daniel knew the signs. The hunched shoulders, the fear of loud voices, the way Liam flinched when a door slammed. Daniel had seen it in his own childhood, in neighbors who'd weathered too many storms. He'd sworn then to be the kind of man who fixed things, not broke them. As he locked the school's gates one night, the slide rule in his pocket felt heavier, a promise to the man he'd been and the justice he'd claim. Nathan thought he'd humiliated a nobody, but Daniel was already 3 steps ahead, his notebook filling with the kind of truth that could bring a billionaire to his knees. The fight wasn't loud, not yet, but it was coming, and Daniel Brooks was ready to build something unbreakable from the ashes of Nathan's scorn. The grand ballroom of Oakridge Preparatory School glittered under chandeliers, transformed for the annual fundraiser into a showcase of Fairfax, Virginia's elite, where champagne flutes clinked and designer dresses rustled against polished floors. Parents and donors mingled, their laughter masking the undercurrent of tension that had simmered since Nathan Caldwell's public outburst against Daniel Brooks weeks ago. Nathan, in a tailored navy suit, held court near the open bar, his voice loud as he boasted about his latest condo project to a circle of nodding admirers. "Oakridge needs to clean house, starting with that custodian," he said, his smirk sharp as a blade, oblivious to the storm brewing. Daniel Brooks, still in his Navy custodian's uniform, moved quietly through the crowd, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies, his presence a silent rebuke to the whispers that followed him. Parents averted their eyes, some out of guilt, others out of disdain. But Daniel's focus was razor-sharp, his worn slide rule tucked in his pocket like a loaded gun. Tonight wasn't about sweeping floors, it was about tearing down a facade. For weeks, Daniel had been meticulous, piecing together evidence of Nathan's illegal waste dumping with the precision he'd once used to design clean energy systems at Ecotech Solutions. His notebook, filled with dates, photos, and overheard snippets from Nathan's careless parking lot calls, was now a weapon, backed by a USB drive from Rachel Evans, his old colleague turned environmental activist. Rachel had connected him to an EPA investigator, and together they'd built a case that could sink Caldwell developments. But Daniel wasn't just after Nathan's business. He wanted the truth about Liam's life exposed, the boy's silent suffering under his father's neglect laid bare. Liam, who'd become Daniel's shadow, deserved more than a father who saw him as a prop. As Daniel adjusted a flickering spotlight near the stage, his hands steady but his heart pounding, he caught Liam's eye across the room. The boy, dressed in a stiff blazer, gave a small, nervous wave, his trust in Daniel a quiet fire that fueled what was coming. The evening's program began, with Principal Margaret Voss at the podium, her voice tight as she praised the school's community spirit. Nathan, seated at a front table, clapped loudly, his confidence unshaken, certain his influence would see Daniel fired by morning. But when Margaret announced a special presentation on school safety, the room hushed as Daniel stepped onto the stage, his uniform drawing gasps. Nathan's glass froze halfway to his lips, his smirk fading. "What the hell is he doing up there?" he muttered, loud enough for nearby tables to turn. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice steady, like a man who'd waited 15 years for this moment. "Good evening, folks," he began, his Virginia drawl warm but firm, like a neighbor sharing hard truths over a backyard fence. "I'm Daniel Brooks, the guy who sweeps your kids' classrooms. But I wasn't always a custodian. 15 years ago, I was an environmental engineer at Ecotech Solutions, designing systems to protect places like Fairfax from pollution, until Nathan Caldwell's company framed me for a whistleblower scandal to bury my work and steal my patents."
The ballroom went silent, forks clattering against plates. Nathan's face drained of color, his jaw slack as if he'd been sucker punched. Parents exchanged stunned glances, their phones forgotten in their hands. Daniel held up his notebook, its pages worn but damning. "For weeks, I've heard Mr. Caldwell call me a threat, a nobody who shouldn't be near his son, Liam. But while he was pointing fingers, I was listening.
In the school parking lot, right outside these walls, I overheard him bragging about dumping toxic waste at his Fairfax construction site, violations that could poison our water, our kids' future. He clicked a remote, and a projector lit up with photos, barrels of chemical waste, forged permits, emails from Nathan's own laptop left carelessly in his unlocked car. The crowd gasped, some leaning forward, others whispering in shock. Nathan bolted to his feet, his voice a snarl. "This is a setup. You can't just record me, you lowlife." "Actually, he can," Rachel Evans interrupted, stepping onto the stage with a federal badge glinting at her side, an EPA investigator she'd brought along. "Conversations in a public parking lot have no expectation of privacy, Mr. Caldwell. And these documents, they're headed to the EPA tonight." The investigator, a no-nonsense woman in a gray blazer, nodded, her presence a silent hammer. Daniel's eyes locked on Nathan's, unflinching. "But this isn't just about your business, Mr. Caldwell. It's about Liam, your son, who you leave waiting alone for hours, who flinches when you raise your voice, who draws solar panels because he dreams of a better world than the one you're building." The room's air seemed to thicken, every eye on Nathan, who stood frozen, his hands trembling. Then a small voice broke the silence. Liam, escorted by a school counselor, stepped forward, his blazer too big for his frame, his eyes wet but resolute. "Mr. Daniel's right," he said, his voice shaking but clear, like a kid finally letting out a truth he'd carried too long. "Dad yells at me, locks me in my room when I mess up. He says I'm not good enough. But Mr. Daniel listens to me. He's my friend." The words hit like a thunderclap, parents gasping, some wiping tears. A mother in the back, who'd once whispered about Daniel's suspicious behavior, covered her mouth, her face crumpling with shame. Nathan's legs wobbled, and he sank back into his chair, his empire unraveling in front of Fairfax's elite. Daniel's chest tightened, not with triumph, but with the weight of Liam's courage. He'd known the boy's pain, seen it in the way Liam clung to his drawings, in the fear that shadowed his eyes. 15 years ago, Daniel had lost everything, his career, his name, because men like Nathan saw him as disposable. But tonight, he wasn't the naive engineer who'd trusted the system to save him. He'd learned to fight with evidence, with patience, with the kind of precision that could dismantle a man's arrogance. "I didn't come here to shame anyone," Daniel said, his voice softening but firm. "I came to protect this community, our kids, our home, and to show you that a man's worth isn't in his job or his skin. It's in what he does when no one's looking." The crowd was silent, some nodding, others staring at Nathan, who looked small for the first time, his bluster gone. At a natural pace of 150 to 160 words per minute. Maintain clarity and light emotional nuance suitable for American storytelling. Eddie, the groundskeeper, stood at the back, his weathered face breaking into a grin as he clapped, the sound sparking a ripple of applause that grew, hesitant at first, then thunderous. Rachel handed Daniel a folder, EPA complaints ready to file, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it, Dan," she whispered. Nathan, cornered, stammered, "This is lies, all of it." But his voice was drowned out by the crowd's murmurs, the tide turning against him. The counselor led Liam off stage, the boy glancing back at Daniel with a look of trust that cut deeper than any victory. As Daniel stepped down, his slide rule heavy in his pocket, he felt the weight of 15 years lift, replaced by a fire that wasn't anger, but purpose. Nathan thought he'd buried a nobody, but Daniel had just unearthed the truth that would bury him instead. The fundraiser went on, but the room was different now, buzzing with whispers of justice, of a man who'd turned a broom into a gavel. The dust hadn't even settled from the Oakridge Preparatory School fundraiser when Nathan Caldwell's world began to crumble like a sandcastle at high tide. By Monday morning, the Fairfax rumor mill was in overdrive, with parents at the school's drop-off line whispering about the FBI's raid on Caldwell Development's offices, their voices a mix of shock and barely concealed glee. News vans parked outside the school, reporters clamoring for quotes about the billionaire brought low by a janitor. Nathan's face, once a fixture on Virginia business magazines, was now splashed across local headlines, his smug grin replaced by a mugshot after the FBI charged him with multiple counts of illegal waste dumping. Social media buzzed with clips from Daniel Brooks's bombshell presentation, photos of toxic barrels, Nathan's own voice admitting to covering tracks, and, most damning, little Liam's trembling testimony about his father's neglect. The elite of Fairfax, who'd once clapped for Nathan's donations, turned their backs, their cocktail party invites drying up faster than a summer creek. Nathan, holed up in his McLean mansion, was a man unmoored, his phone silent as clients bailed and his board demanded his resignation. He'd thought he was untouchable, but Daniel's evidence had cracked his empire wide open, and the weight of his own arrogance was pulling him under. Daniel Brooks, meanwhile, walked the halls of Oakridge with a different kind of weight, one of quiet vindication. The parents who'd once whispered troublemaker behind his back now avoided his gaze, their faces flushed with shame or defiance. Principal Margaret Voss, whose silence had enabled Nathan's smear campaign, resigned under pressure, her farewell email citing personal reasons but fooling no one. The school board, scrambling to save face, offered Daniel a new role, Director of Facilities and Community Outreach, a position that let him use his engineering expertise to overhaul the school's aging infrastructure. "You've shown us what leadership looks like," the new principal, Dr. Ellen Harper, said, her handshake firm and her eyes apologetic. Daniel accepted, trading his custodian's uniform for a collared shirt and a desk, though he kept the worn slide rule in his pocket, a reminder of the road he'd traveled. It wasn't about the title, it was about proving he was more than the nobody Nathan had tried to make him. But the real reward was Liam, who'd been placed in the temporary care of his aunt, Laura Caldwell, a soft-spoken librarian who'd always suspected her brother's cruelty, but lacked the courage to act. Laura found Daniel in his new office, her eyes red but grateful. "I believed Nathan's lies about you," she admitted, her voice breaking. "You saved Liam when I didn't. Thank you." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. He'd spent 15 years rebuilding from a scandal that stole his career, and now, seeing Laura's relief, he felt the pieces of his own life slotting back together. Daniel Brooks, meanwhile, walked the halls of Oakridge with a different kind of weight, one of quiet vindication. The parents who'd once whispered troublemaker behind his back now avoided his gaze, their faces flushed with shame or defiance. Principal Margaret Voss, whose silence had enabled Nathan's smear campaign, resigned under pressure, her farewell email citing personal reasons but fooling no one. The school board, scrambling to save face, offered Daniel a new role, Director of Facilities and Community Outreach, a position that let him use his engineering expertise to overhaul the school's aging infrastructure. "You've shown us what leadership looks like," the new principal, Dr. Ellen Harper, said, her handshake firm and her eyes apologetic. Daniel accepted, trading his custodian's uniform for a collared shirt and a desk, though he kept the worn slide rule in his pocket, a reminder of the road he'd traveled. It wasn't about the title, it was about proving he was more than the nobody Nathan had tried to make him. But the real reward was Liam, who'd been placed in the temporary care of his aunt, Laura Caldwell, a soft-spoken librarian who'd always suspected her brother's cruelty but lacked the courage to act. Laura found Daniel in his new office, her eyes red but grateful. "I believed Nathan's lies about you," she admitted, her voice breaking. "You saved Liam when I didn't. Thank you." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. He'd spent 15 years rebuilding from a scandal that stole his career, and now, seeing Laura's relief, he felt the pieces of his own life slotting back together. At a natural pace of 150 to 160 words per minute, maintain clarity and light emotional nuance suitable for American storytelling. Liam, free from his father's shadow, started to bloom. The boy, once hunched and silent, now ran to Daniel's office after school, his backpack stuffed with sketches of wind turbines and solar panels, his chatter filling the room with a lightness Daniel hadn't heard before. One afternoon, Liam handed him a drawing, a blueprint of a clean energy school, scrawled in marker but precise in its own way. "You think I could be an engineer like you, Mr. Daniel?" he asked, his eyes bright with hope. Daniel's heart swelled, memories of his own childhood in Richmond flashing back. His dad's greasy overalls, his calloused hands teaching him to fix a carburetor, saying, "Build something that lasts, son." "You're already on your way, Liam," Daniel said, pinning the drawing to his bulletin board, a quiet promise to guide the boy toward a future his father had tried to dim. That bond, fragile but real, was worth more than any apology Nathan could muster. The school itself was changing too, shaken awake by Daniel's stand. The board, spurred by public outcry, adopted new anti-discrimination policies, dubbed the Brooks Standards, mandating diversity training and a zero-tolerance stance on prejudice. Parents who'd once nodded along with Nathan's venom now signed up to fund a scholarship for low-income students, their checks a silent apology for their complicity. Margaret Reed, the yoga mom who'd whispered, "You never know with these people," pulled her kids from Oakridge, her social stock plummeting as friends distanced themselves from her tainted reputation. At a town hall, one father, a lawyer who'd stayed quiet during Nathan's tirade, stood up and said, "We let this happen. We owe Daniel more than an apology. We owe him a better school." The crowd clapped, tentative but growing, and Daniel, standing at the back, felt a flicker of pride, not for himself, but for the community starting to see what he'd always known. Fairness wasn't a gift, it was a fight. Nathan, meanwhile, sent a letter from his holding cell, scrawled on cheap paper, the ink smudged like his pride. "Mr. Brooks," it began, the formality a stark contrast to his earlier venom, "I misjudged you. I see now what you did for Liam. I'm sorry." Daniel read it in his office, the words heavy but hollow. Nathan's regret wasn't about remorse. It was about losing, about the boardroom empire he'd built on lies crumbling under the weight of truth. Daniel folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, not out of forgiveness, but because he didn't need Nathan's words to feel whole. He'd fought for Liam, for himself, for the kid he'd been who dreamed of building a better world. That was enough. Eddie, the groundskeeper, stopped by Daniel's office one evening, a six-pack of local craft beer in hand, a Virginia tradition after a long week. "You showed 'em, Dan," he said, cracking a can and sliding one over. "Knew you had it in you." Daniel laughed, the sound rare and warm, and clinked his can against Eddie's. "Just doing what's right, man," he said, but his eyes held a glint of something deeper, a man who turned pain into purpose. The Fairfax sunset glowed outside, painting the school's lawn gold, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt like he was standing on solid ground, not just sweeping it. Nathan had tried to break him, but all he'd done was light a fuse. And as Daniel sipped his beer, Liam's drawing on the wall, he knew the real work, building a legacy, was just beginning. At a natural pace of 150 to 160 words per minute, maintain clarity and light emotional nuance suitable for American storytelling. 6 months after the fundraiser that turned Fairfax upside down, Oakridge Preparatory School felt like a different world. Its halls humming with a new kind of energy, like a town rebuilt after a storm. Daniel Brooks, no longer pushing a broom, but sitting behind a desk as Director of Facilities and Community Outreach, had become the heartbeat of the change. His office, once a janitor's closet, was now lined with blueprints for energy-efficient upgrades and thank you notes from students, pinned next to Liam Caldwell's colorful sketches of solar panels. The Brooks Standards, a set of anti-discrimination policies Daniel had crafted, were now mandatory, with diversity workshops and a whistleblower hotline ensuring no kid or staffer would ever feel invisible again. Delegates from schools across Virginia visited, jotting notes on how Oakridge had become a model for equity, their polished loafers echoing in hallways once silent with complicity. Daniel, at 47, stood taller, his worn slide rules still in his pocket, a quiet nod to the engineer he'd always been, now shaping a legacy bigger than any blueprint he'd drawn at Ecotech Solutions. Outside, the Fairfax autumn painted the school's lawn in shades of crimson and gold, and Daniel often found himself staring out his window, reflecting on the road from Richmond's rough streets to this moment. His father's words, "Build something that lasts, son," rang truer now than ever, etched into every decision he made. Liam, now thriving under his Aunt Laura's care, was a daily reminder of why he'd fought. The boy bounded into Daniel's office one crisp afternoon, his backpack bouncing, a science fair ribbon pinned to his jacket. "Mr. Daniel, check it out," Liam grinned, holding up a model wind turbine, its blades spinning in the breeze from an open window. "I got first place. Told him I want to be an engineer like you." Daniel's chest tightened, a mix of pride and something softer, like the feeling of coming home. He saw his younger self in Liam, the kid who tinkered with broken radios, dreaming of fixing the world. "You're gonna outdo me, Liam," Daniel said, his voice warm, ruffling the boy's hair. "Just keep building, and don't let anybody tell you what you can't do." Liam's eyes sparkled, his confidence a stark contrast to the hunched, fearful kid Daniel had met months ago, proof that a single act of care could rewrite a life. Nathan Caldwell, meanwhile, was a ghost in Fairfax's elite circles, his name synonymous with disgrace. Serving a 7-year sentence for environmental violations and child neglect, he'd lost his company, his mansion, and his family. His arrogance no match for the truth Daniel had unearthed. Laura, now raising Liam in a modest townhouse, had cut ties with her brother, finding her own strength in the aftermath. At a school board meeting, she stood up, her voice steady, and said, "Daniel Brooks didn't just save my nephew. He showed us what courage looks like." The room erupted in applause. Parents who'd once shunned Daniel now nodding, some even asking for selfies, their hypocrisy as clear as the Virginia sky. Daniel didn't care for their approval. He cared about the kids who now felt safe to speak up, about the janitors and teachers who walked taller because of his fight. One evening, as the school emptied, Daniel sat at his desk, a local newspaper open to an article about his journey. From custodian to crusader, how one man changed a school. He smiled faintly, thinking of Eddie, the groundskeeper, who'd brought him a beer to celebrate, saying, "You showed him, Dan, never bet against the underdog." But the real victory wasn't the headlines or the new title. It was Liam's laughter, the school's new heart, and the knowledge that he'd turned pain into progress. Daniel leaned back, his slide rule catching the light, and thought of his dad, who'd never lived to see this day. He'd built something that would last, not just for Liam, but for every kid who'd ever been told they didn't belong. Nathan had tried to bury him, but Daniel had risen, proving that the quietest man in the room could leave the loudest legacy.
The story of Daniel Brooks teaches us that true worth isn't measured by titles, wealth, or the color of your skin, but by the courage to stand tall against injustice and the heart to lift others up. In a world quick to judge, Daniel's journey from a scorned custodian to a beacon of change reminds us that prejudice thrives in silence, but truth, wielded with patience and resolve, can shatter even the most arrogant facades. It's a lesson rooted in the American adage, "Don't judge a book by its cover," urging us to look beyond appearances and see the strength within. For every Nathan who wields power to belittle, there's a Daniel quietly building a legacy of fairness, proving that resilience isn't about shouting back, it's about proving them wrong with actions. This speaks to all of us, especially those who felt dismissed or undervalued. Your value isn't defined by others' biases, but by the integrity you carry through life's storms. Break the toxic silence, stand up for what's right, and embrace the diversity that makes us human. In doing so, we not only find our own worth, but create a world where every Liam can dream without fear. Here's to finding peace after the chaos and to building a future where everyone's voice is heard. Stay strong, stay hopeful,